If you're a small business owner, you'll know just what it's like to be the chief everything officer. HR, payroll, employee benefits. Well, Gusto can do all of that for you. Gusto is online payroll and benefits software built for small businesses. It's all in one, remote friendly, and incredibly easy to use. It's quick and simple to switch to Gusto. Just transfer your existing data to get up and running fast. Try Gusto today at gusto.com/lockedonsoccer and get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. That's gusto.com/lockedonsoccer.
The world's biggest soccer tournament has arrived, and you can trade the entire tournament on Kalshi. On Kalshi, you can trade every match from the opening stage all the way to the final. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app and use code CUP26 to get $10 when you trade 10. KALSHI, Kalshi. Trade the beautiful game. 18 plus only. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory.
The entire summer of soccer is on PrizePicks, all 48 countries in every matchup, and if you rep your side before the round of 16 on PrizePicks, you can win a trip to the finals in New York. It's the biggest tournament ever, which means there's even more opportunities to cash in while you root for your favorite national sides and global soccer stars. Download the app today and use code CUP26 to get $50 instantly in lineups when you play your first $5. Download the app today and use code CUP26 to get $50 instantly in lineups when you play your first $5. PrizePicks, America's #1 sports picks app.
Hello and welcome back to the Hibs Observer's Dunbar End podcast with myself, Jack Harris, joined as ever by Hibs Observer editor Patrick McPartland. It's a busy episode this week, a lot to talk about, principally, Patrick, that pre-season friendly draw with FC Porto and during that little warm weather training camp in Portugal. It's difficult to take too much from a pre-season game, but sort of a strong side, a lot of first-team players involved as well. Porto, the reigning Portuguese champions, two-time Champions League winners in the past as well. Borja Sainz got the goal just on the cusp of half-time. I think he had a couple of goals disallowed as well. There were a couple of strikes off the woodwork. Salinger got involved and had a busy day, but it was Felix Paslak who got the goal for David Gray's side. I think in the 80th minute, getting onto the end of a cross at the far post, as he does. And yeah, a promising result. I think David Gray was happy with what happened, what he saw. And it's good preparations for Europe coming up not too far in the future.
It is, yeah. And we talk about pre-season friendlies all the time and what it means, what it doesn't mean. I think the reaction to the defeat by Shamrock Rovers kind of told the story. It's, you're still playing in June. It's about minutes and legs. You're missing kind of 7 or 8 of your first team players. It's never wise, I think, to take too much from pre-season friendlies. Hibs beat Arsenal 2-1. In a pre-season friendly not that long ago. And if I recall correctly, the season wasn't particularly memorable. So, it doesn't, like, yes, you can have a bit of banter. You can look at it and say, oh, Hibs sort of stunned Portuguese champions, that kind of thing. But, I mean, they are a little more than training games. But, I think as you progress through the pre-season kind of stage, you will get the manager sort of trying things out a bit more, maybe settling on a kind of strongest 11 or an 11 that he feels is the sort of one he wants to start the season off with. And I think you can see that. You could see it with even going back to the bounce game against St Johnstone, you could see it against in the team lineup against Porto that, we're starting to see things take shape a little bit. We're starting to get an idea of, I think, what David Gray thinks is the strongest 11 at this stage. I mean, we will expect people to go out. We will expect there to be further arrivals, so that's from David Gray himself. So the landscape will change, I think, before certainly the start of the domestic season, or maybe 2 or 3 weeks into it, depending on when players go and players come in. But I think on the face of it, it sounds as though Porto kind of flipping murdered Hibs as the line goes, but it's finished 1-1, and I think it's not bad practice for when if Hibs are in Europe and they come up against sort of formidable opposition. And I know again it's a pre-season friendly. Porto were given several of their sort of like second stringers a run out, that sort of thing. But it's a confidence booster, and I think it's good practice in sort of playing a game in probably like warmer weather than we've been experiencing in Scotland. Just playing a slightly different style. If you think, in recent weeks in the pre-season friendlies, Hibs have played another Scottish Premiership side. They've played a League of Ireland Premier Division side, and they've played a NIFL Premiership side. So that's 3 teams from 3 different leagues, and now Porto, it's a 4th team from a 4th different league. And it's just, I think it's quite good to get that kind of breadth of experience of playing against different types of football, different types of players. And, because I think the Conference League is a bit of an unknown. You're coming up against teams, and, there may not be an awful lot of kind of video out there and analysis that you can do beforehand. So you just have to ensure you're kind of prepared as best you can be. And things like this in the Porto game, St Johnstone Bounce game, it's good ways of ensuring the players are as prepared as they can be. And I think it's, you can look at the fact that Azim Abdullah and Callum Wright got their first sort of appearances in a Hibs shirt after the Bounce game, obviously, but just building up minutes, I suppose, after not featuring in Ireland at all. And, I think when Bromby come calling on Saturday, Hibs playing the Danish side at 1 p.m. at Easter Road, we'll probably get a further indication of what David Gray feels is the strongest 11 at this point, who is likely to start the European game or the first leg against Vlasnia or Malasheva. And I think, there'll probably be a lot to learn from that game, and we'll probably see sort of like the benefits of playing the 4 previous games on Saturday at Easter Road, and be better placed to kind of grade where Hibs are at after pre-season or after the bulk of pre-season and going into the European games. But on paper, it's a good result for Hibs to go over there and hold Porto to a 1-1 draw. But it does sound as though what's the cliche, like the Hibs goal was leading a bit of a charmed life with these sort of like offsides and the woodwork being hit. Well, incredible double saves by Raphael Salinger. So again, it's just one of these things where final results don't always tell the sort of full story of a game. But on the face of it, it's a good point against very good opposition, and I'm sure there'll be lots of good bits from it, and there'll be lots of things that David Gray wants to work on, which is obviously the benefit of having these pre-season games against different opposition. So we'll see what comes out of that, and I think we'll see how it sort of influences Saturday's game against Bromby.
Well, there was a wry smile on David Gray's face, I think, in one of the post-match videos. Where he was saying, it's never just a friendly. I feel like we should have sort of t-shirts. We should get t-shirts with David Gray phrases on them. Persevere Originals, if you're listening. It's never just a friendly. And I think sort of Raphael Salinger might have agreed with that. It did sound like he was having a bit of a tough day at the office. Obviously, did very well, as we'd expect from the Austrian.
In fairness to Rafa, I saw him in training during the pre-season training camp, and that's a man who does not like to lose goals, even in training sessions. So sort of softly spoken in media interviews, calming presence at the back. But if he lets in a goal that he doesn't feel he should have let in, then he's not a happy man. So that's one thing
the pair of you have in common then. I still remember the look on your face when I scored past you in 7-a-side. But we'll move on quickly from that particular avenue of conversation. No, I think you're absolutely right that, from what we've seen so far from the Porto game, obviously not able to watch it behind closed doors friendly, you don't really get the sense of exactly how things were set up. But the 3 new signings all getting minutes. I think Jason Kerr played the full game, and then Callum Wright and Azim Abdullah maybe sort of 60 minutes each. Abdullah playing alongside Mulligan, who got the 90 minutes, which is great for him. Obviously coming back from that injury and had a couple of games, sort of cameo appearances from the bench towards the end of the season. But by all accounts, when you sort of look at the lineup, you kind of think it's Abdullah and Mulligan in behind Callum Wright. But obviously, David Gray's spoken about Callum Wright, saying that he can be more of a box-to-box player than a number 10. He can obviously play out wide. Abdullah, he can be a box-to-box player. So I think it's just the versatility in having those options. And from everything we've heard so far from Hibs players, from David Gray himself, from the coaching staff, there seems to be the intent to try and compete as much as he can on all fronts. I think that's a given for any football club, but for Hibs in particular, it's this, performances need to be better in the league to try and secure European football. That's a goal. Getting through to the group stage, the league phases. Sorry, I can't keep track. The league phases of the Conference League. That's a goal as well, and doing that will necessitate that sort of 2-game week. So it is good to have a number of different options and players who can play this sort of versatile role. And that's something that's really good out of these preseason games and the bounce games, is just allowing David Gray the time to sort of tinker with the formation, tinker with the personnel. But I mean, you mentioned sort of second string players for Porto. When you look at, I'm just looking at it now, you look at the Hibs lineup, it's more or less what you'd maybe expect at this point from a kind of first team starting lineup. I mean, there are a couple of players missing, obviously, the likes of Nicky Cadden, Ante Shuto, and Jamie McGrath, who you probably think they're going to be involved from the start or sort of definitely competing for those places. But that sort of trio weren't in Portugal, definitely weren't in the match day squad.
Yeah, so I think Shuto definitely sat out the Cliftonville friendly in Ireland. And I'm imagining I'm not 100% sure. I'm imagining he may have missed the bounce game against St Johnstone as well. I'd imagine that might have been something like just something picked up in training, like a knock, a tweak, something like that. You don't want to risk making worse. At this stage of the season, there are kind of like double, triple sessions in training. And I mean, we talked about the Shamrock Rovers game, and that was he did actually take quite a sore one in that game. I mean, I described it as quite physical, and had a couple of Shamrock Rovers fans kind of making fun of my take on that. But I think, it was sort of forgetting the fact that it wasn't like physical for a preseason friendly, because quite often you watch preseason friendlies and there's not an awful lot of kind of meaty challenges flying in. And I think, there were a few in the Shamrock Rovers friendly, and that's, it's possible that, Shuto might have picked something up there. I think in terms of Nicky Cadden and Jamie McGrath, I think they possibly sort of picked up minor knocks in the bounce game against St Johnstone. So that would, again, it would make sense not to risk them if you're wanting them for the European games. Obviously, you don't want to risk making anything worse. You just want to give them a chance to kind of rest it and then come back into training so that they're able to contribute in some way rather than not at all. And I think, we talk a lot about European kind of qualification campaigns, and we talk a lot about the domestic front as well. And I think depending on the size of your squad, like if you're a Rangers or a Celtic, then you can maybe manage it a little bit easier because you've maybe got a bigger squad with probably more kind of first team ready players than maybe the likes of Aberdeen, previously Hearts, Hibs, Motherwell, you name it. And I think that it's a bit of a balancing act, and I think we can see David Gray as he sort of progresses through his management career. We can see him learning from previous mistakes, or we can see him changing things up based on what he's experienced previously. So I think he'll maybe look at the European games last season. He'll look at how the team was able to get, they got a good result in Denmark against Midtjylland. They got a very good result against Partizan in Serbia, and then obviously so close in Warsaw against Legia. But domestically, it was, Hibs weren't really able to put together a full 90 minutes. And it kind of, that's hampered them. We talk about early season games of like, it could be a useful point come the end of the season, or, they could make the difference. And I think that, we probably saw that with the number of games that Hibs drew. I think it was 5-6 games in a row that they drew. And, in more than a few of them, they should have been, they should absolutely have been Hibs victories. And I think, we probably saw sort of David Gray like tinkering with his lineup a little bit so that, players who played on a Thursday night in Belgrade weren't sort of being asked to play sort of on a Sunday as well if they'd been, maybe like the legs are feeling a bit heavy. You don't want to risk injury. You don't want to risk burnout. You just want to kind of keep your strongest 11 available. And I think if you look at the team at the moment, I think even if you sort of pick a strong starting 11, which is roughly based on the kind of bones of last season's squad. So if you've got Raphael Salinger, and then you've got a back three of Warren O'Hora and Jack Iredale in there. And at the moment, you would assume Jason Kerr in the middle, Felix Paslak and Jordan Obita and Nicky Cadden as the wing backs. In midfield, I think you'd be looking at having probably Mulligan and Chaiwa in the centre, and then Jamie McGrath as the 10. And then up front, probably Martin Boyle and Owen Elding. So that's like a strong starting 11. That's a starting 11 that if you were a Hibs fan and you saw that last season or this season, you say, yeah, that's probably about as strong a squad as we could put out, and that's that's not allowing for the likes of having Grant Hanley in the squad, and then you'd have Callum Wright, you'd have Azim Abdullahi. Well, he's injured, so
but just through when
I'm talking
if he was available.
But I'm talking about available players. That's the thing. So even with Rocky being out and with an Achilles injury, I mean, Chris Cadden was out with a similar injury for I think the best part of a year. I think it might have been about sort of 10 months, something like that. So, obviously we hope that Rockies wouldn't have the same sort of time frame on it, but Hibs I think will be kind of planning in the in the case that it is that long. So, in terms of the available players, then by the time Europe rolls around, we had that starting 11 we just talked about, and you look at the ones who you've got Grant Hanley, you'll probably be on the bench. You have got Chris Cadden in there who scored in Europe last season. You've then got Ante Shuto, assuming that his knock is nothing kind of long term, nothing more serious. You've got Thibaut Clige. You've got I'm running out of people here. You've got Joe Newell who can come into the midfield. Callum Wright, Azim Abdullahi. I'm almost certainly forgetting players as well. Josh Campbell, Rudy Milotnikov. These players who are kind of coming back into it, and players who you think they could probably start a game and not weaken the sort of strength of the starting lineup. I think it's just when you start to introduce too many players, you're making like 6 or 7 changes for like a League Cup game, then that's when it can be a little bit sort of risky, I think. And I completely understand why you would do that. I understand why why you would sort of look to rest your players and think, well, we've got a real chance of progressing in Europe. And I think it's probably the same when you look at the Scottish Cup game against Dunfermline. I don't think that was necessarily David Gray thinking, this is the strongest team I can put out. I think it was him thinking, this is a team that has changes, but I think is still strong enough to get a result against opposition in the division below. And had Hibs taken their chances, had they not been, profligate in front of goal, if you like, then there's a good chance they would have won that game. And the fact they didn't, you can put it down to a number of factors, but I think that's something that, they'll be looking to avoid this season. Again, I talk about learning from mistakes. And if you can have a situation where you've got a strong starting 11 in Europe on the Thursday, and then come the Sunday, 4 or 5 of your subs who've come on and maybe played the last 20 to 30 minutes on the Thursday night can maybe play the first sort of 60 to 70 on the Sunday, and then you can have subs sort of taking over from them. And so no one's kind of being overloaded. Minutes obviously have to be managed, especially at this point in the campaign. With a big season ahead and everything like that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that's managed, because there are certainly in midfield at the moment, there are a lot of players in there. You've also got some younger players who are on cooperation loans or may head out on cooperation loans who have been with the first team squad in pre-season, have played in some of the pre-season games, and could very well be options for having sort of more Scottish players in the squad. And obviously in Europe you get the expanded bench as well, so there's sort of room for those young players to come in. And at the same time, I think we've heard David Gray say quite a lot that he's only going to have people in the squad who he feels are capable of doing a job on the pitch. So it's not just going to be numbers for the sake of it. It's going to be players who, if selected, if called upon, can actually come on and make a difference. So I think my kind of overwhelming takeaway from seeing the game so far is that we've seen quite a few different kind of lineup combinations. We've seen quite a few kind of formation changes. So we've seen the kind of 3-4-2-1 that they started with against Shamrock Rovers, and then the kind of 3-4-3 in the second half. They reverted back to 3-4-1-2 in the first half against Cliftonville. They then went to 4-2-3-1 in the second half. So, again, pre-season's time for trying things out. And I think, Gray's been doing that potentially with one eye on Europe and, probably further down the line domestically as well. But I think, the main thing is that you have a lot of players. You have a squad of players who, when you look at the bench, you go, that's a strong bench, because certainly for domestic games, you'd be saying any one of those players could arguably start. And in Europe, you're probably going to say, the bulk of those on the bench would be, players capable of starting, and then maybe sort of 2 or 3 younger players who you might have to exercise caution with because, they are that little bit, or they do have that less experience at that level. And you obviously don't want to risk sort of like putting too much pressure on them, putting them in a situation that could have negative kind of long-lasting impact. But I think when you look at who they're bringing in, Jason Kerr, Azim Abdullahi, Callum Wright, 3 players who had, good seasons last season, I think, broadly speaking, especially, Callum Wright cleaning up at the end of season awards. But it's not players who, will come and be content with sitting on the bench. Like, they're here to play, they're here to start games. It kind of keeps that competition healthy, and it also means that you have a strong squad. So if you're going to the bench, you're not sort of diminishing the strength of the starting lineup. You're merely sort of taking somebody out and then replacing them with someone in virtually all areas of the pitch, somebody at the same level. And I think that could be really important this season. I don't think Hibs had that last season. Certainly not in the European games. I mean, they had it to a certain extent, but it did feel a little bit, and it always does at this stage when you're starting off playing European games in like the 3rd week in July or whatever, or 4th week in July. Like, you are sort of still fairly early on in the transfer window, and there's still a lot of business to be done. But I think at this stage compared to last season, I think Hibs are probably in a better place in terms of having players who are kind of ready to play, who can come off the bench, make an impact, or can start games as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the squad feels in a very good place in that regard, especially when you sort of look through the lineups or who's been involved in pre-season and just sort of see the combinations. Patrick, I know you've worked on a formations piece, I think, for tomorrow morning. It's just worth pointing out that will be available on the Hibs Observer's website. So do pop over there. I think it's for subscribers only. So do support us if you can. It really does make all the difference. It's £12 for 12 months at the minute. We've also got a dedicated app where I think is the best reading enjoyment for such articles as Patrick's will be tomorrow. So feel free to download that once you've subscribed, and we'd love to have you on board and help support the work we do in the videos we make, the articles we write, the interviews we do, the long-winded advertising sales that we speak about. And yeah, so do please join us for more of that. Now, one of those articles, Patrick, was, of course, your exclusive interview with Josh Mulligan, which you had during, I think, towards the end of Hibs's Ireland pre-season camp, and that was published at the tail end of last week. If you've not had a chance to read it, do pop over and do so. But David Gray talking about the importance of Josh Mulligan getting those 90 minutes in the recent game against you. I've already forgotten FC Porto. That's the one. How could I forget FC Porto? European giant. Josh Mulligan obviously playing those 90 minutes, coming back from injury and just being involved again. I think Gray was very keen to say how important that is, having him back and getting minutes into his legs. Obviously not taking risks, but it does seem like he's come through the worst of those injury. I know he spoke to you about that recovery period in detail. I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I think really, really interesting to speak to Josh because, I mean, we covered this in the piece, but I think, one of the most talked about players in Scottish football, I think just because of his performances for Hibs and then his season being cut short by that sort of late challenge in the Scottish Cup defeat by Dunfermline. But you saw his performances for Hibs in the first half of the season. You saw his goal against Legia Warsaw to kind of keep the tie alive in the first leg at Easter Road. And just the kind of the energy and the kind of dynamism that he brought to the midfield. And I think it was only really obvious when he came back into the side for like the final 2 games against Rangers and Motherwell that you thought, God, Hibs really have missed him in midfield. And I think, part of the reason that maybe it wasn't obvious to begin with was because you had, Miguel Chaiwa in there, who is, a bit like a Duracell bunny, runs and runs, just keeps going, covers every blade of grass. He'll pop up in front of the back 4, then the next thing he's kind of lurking on the edge of the D, supporting the attack. And you think, well, hang on, what? How did he do that?
How'd you get there?
Yeah, and I think, there was probably a lot of expectation on Chaiwa to provide some of the running that Mulligan had done, which was a big ask because, Mulligan's a young player, Chaiwa's younger, and it's in his first season in Scottish football. But I think, broadly speaking, apart from the odd game here or there, I think he did fulfill that role really well. But I think you probably saw when Mulligan and Chilwell were playing together, that was like a really hard duo to play against. You could see kind of opposition kind of midfielders and probably defenders that are looking at it and going, it's a lot to deal with. There's physicality in there as well. And, I don't think neither of them are really the quickest, but they didn't need to be because they just could keep hold of the ball. They could just sort of drive forward. In Chilwell's case, he could sort of go into tight areas, win it back. Mulligan's case, he just had that kind of driving forwards and, being a kind of additional attacking outlet. And I think, Hibs did miss having him in the squad in the second half of the season. And I think having him back and, it's somebody really determined to get back as soon as possible. He talked about, I think David Gray talked about this as well, but he talked about coming back hopefully in time for the start of the split and, that game against Hearts, but also at the same time, not wanting to rush it, not wanting to kind of risk it and, risk sort of suffering a setback if you're not 100% ready. So, I think it was probably a shame for Hibs and for Mulligan that he only got the last 2 games of the season and they were sub-appearances, but you could see in those sort of brief cameos just like what he brings to the side, what they've missed. And I think it was good that he got that game time because it meant he could go into pre-season, and not going into it from a point of view of having to make up time. Like he was ready to go with the rest of the squad because he'd had those training sessions at HTC towards the end of the league season. He'd had those substitute appearances. So it wasn't as if there were doubts about him being sort of ready to go. He was, in a position where he'd made his comeback. He'd sort of hurdled the first issue of getting games and just, I think when you've had an injury like that, especially an ankle injury, something like Mulligan's had, there is maybe a little bit of trepidation. Footballers always say, you can't think about that. You have to go into like the first challenge and just do it as if you would if you hadn't ever had the injury. But I think there must be a little bit of trepidation that you don't want anything to go wrong. You just want to get through it. And he's done that, and he obviously contributed to the performance at Ibrox in the 2-1 win against Rangers. And then he got more game time in the sort of final game of the season against Motherwell, which was probably a bit of a damp squib for Hibs just in terms of how that played out and the final result. But really interesting. I mentioned this on social media, but there was a point during the Cliftonville game, and I think it might have been so Hibs scored first in that game, and then Cliftonville equalised very quickly. And I think the scoreline was still 1-1. It might have been 2-1 Hibs, but there was a point where Mulligan was absolutely raging with one of his teammates, so I'm not going to name for obvious reasons, but he felt they hadn't done the right thing. I think it was a pass. I think that, they'd been sort of, they tried a specific pass that wasn't really on, and Mulligan came over and kind of told them exactly what he thought of that. And I just thought this is like an indication of what he's like, because he is this. Here's this player who is sort of 23 years old. He's playing in a bounce game behind closed doors, and he is absolutely fuming with a teammate in a pre-season friendly. It's the second game of the season of pre-season. And as we were saying at the top of the show, like it's minutes and legs. Like, the result is almost immaterial. Performances are almost immaterial as well. It's really about the fitness. It's about the minutes and the legs and, the chance to try new things. But it didn't matter. He was still, basically saying, he should have done this. Next time, do that. Just, do it quicker, that sort of thing. And I sort of, as I said, talked about this on social media. I had people saying, oh, captain material, this sort of stuff. And I think there's probably a totally different conversation there because Felix Pashlack had the armband in the second half against Shamrock Rovers, and he talked about sort of captaining the side, but it not really being as big a thing because he reckons there's like quite a lot of leadership in that dressing room, and it's more about kind of taking responsibility. So one of the things he was saying was when he came to Hibs, he wanted to sort of take responsibility as maybe one of the older players in the dressing room. And, I think if you look at the back line, if you look at Warren O'Hora's worn the armbands, it would be no surprise if Jason Kerr wore it at some point. Pashlack's worn it. Martin Boyle's worn it. Joe Newell, obviously the club captain. I think Jordan Abita's possibly worn it before in the past.
Did Grant Hanley wear it at one point as well? I thought maybe he
possibly. If we're talking sort of, Yeah, I mean, if we're talking sort of like the last 15, 20 minutes of games, that sort of thing, we probably do have the info somewhere to run down and see just how many people wore the armband for Hibs last season. I think Chris Cadden wore it at one point as well. So,
Yeah.
there is that sort of leadership thing where there were a lot of players capable of taking the armband. And obviously Mulligan was never mentioned in that kind of conversation. But I think, we've seen not just that sort of moment against Cliftonville, but just in general, just someone who demands the best from himself and his teammates. Such a high ceiling as well. When you see the teams he's been linked with, and obviously, the Scotland ambitions and sort of being close to that Scotland squad. And you'd have to think that if he hadn't had that ankle injury, then you surely would have been in the conversation about going to the World Cup.
Yeah.
With Scotland. And, obviously talked about the transfer interest, because how could you not? And I think it's interesting, and hopefully he's not going to sort of leave the club in the next sort of 10 to 14 days, because then this will look really really daft from me. But sometimes when you speak to players about transfer speculation, you quite often get sort of similar responses, which is that, I'm just focusing on my game. I'm just I let my agent deal with it. I'm just sort of doing such and such. But I felt he was quite adamant in saying, that he was just kind of focusing on the next game for Hibs and just doing, what he could to sort of come back and sort of be not just where he was last season, but just be a better version of that. And making a point of saying how much he was enjoying playing for the club, and how much he, was happy at Hibs, and how much he wanted to be here. And I think that's the sort of thing that, fans reading that will think, that's what you want to read. You don't want to read something which is a bit kind of flimsy and is a little bit, it's like I'm not. I think what he said was like, I'm not looking to get out the door. And I mean, the transfer interest and the speculation will continue. Obviously it will. He's a very talented player. We've seen, even in the past sort of 12 months with Hibs, we've seen Kieran Bowie go off to Serie A with Hellas Verona. And, you can imagine sort of Italian clubs looking at the likes of, Billy Gilmore, looking at Scott McTominay, looking at closer to the Scottish leagues, to Lewis Ferguson and, Kieran Bowie, Josh Doig. And just sort of thinking, there's obviously a role for kind of all action Scottish midfielders in the Italian top flight. And it wouldn't surprise you. I think there were French teams mentioned as being kind of loosely interested towards the tail end of last year. So, a player who's attracting interest for his performances, and, rightly so, because they have been very good. And somebody who you hope is probably at Hibs for a little while longer, just to kind of just have like a really good season, like, just a full season where you're playing the bulk of the games, adding kind of goals and assists, and, just kind of making that midfield spot his own. And I think from speaking to him, I think obviously, things can change in football very quickly. If a team comes in with an offer which, Hibs feel, well, we can't realistically turn this down, then, things do change. But, Hibs have always been very kind of adamant that any deal for a player leaving has to be right for both them and the club.
Yeah.
And so I think, it depends on the offer. It depends on, the interested team, that sort of thing. But I think it would be a real shame if Hibs did not, or if Hibs and Hibs fans didn't get to see a full season of Josh Mulligan in full flight, because I think after last season, like, some really good performances, and I think, he'll be desperate to make up for lost time. He'll know, he'll have improved just in that sort of 6-month spell with Hibs. And I think just kind of probably raring to go for the new season. Looking forward to playing in Europe again. Looking forward to playing Scottish Premiership games again, and maybe even sort of helping Hibs take a step closer to a trophy as well, which is obviously something the players and the management are hell bent on doing, because they've not, as we discussed on the pod last week, I think they've not had as much joy with that as they have with perhaps the final league finishes since David Gray came in, or since he took the job. So I think there's probably a lot of good reasons for Mulligan to stick around, and you would hope that that's the case. It's obviously been interesting in Chaiwa as well, and you think losing, you could probably just about deal with losing one of them, but if you lost both of them, then that would be two very difficult players to replace adequately in what is probably a short space of time. So yeah, I think I think Hibs would really benefit from having Mulligan for a full season. I think Mulligan would benefit from playing a full season, and just kind of showing exactly what he's capable of doing for Hibs, and that will, you would imagine, sort of no matter who the manager is, sort of translate to the Scotland setup, because things need freshened up in that. This could be a whole different pod, to be honest, but things need freshened up in that sense. And he has been close to the squad before. He was called up to the squad before one of the World Cup qualifiers against Belarus last year, and I think he'll fancy himself to keep putting in the performances for Hibs and get back into that sort of training squad, just to be there, because I think he is kind of on the cusp of it. It's the same with Kieran Bowie, and I think you look at Mulligan's performances in the first half of last season for Hibs, you look at Bowie's performances for Verona towards the end of their season, and you think neither of them can be far away. And the common denominator there is Hibs, that they've had that they've had the sort of chance to kind of progress there, but they've maybe been not in Mulligan's case stagnating, because he was a very good player in that Dundee squad, and it was about kind of taking the next step. For Bowie, it was sort of maybe coming back to a league where he was going to be playing. There were going to be there was going to be regular kind of eyes on him after he was sort of playing down the leagues in England and still kind of playing for Fulham's academy side. So I think a Josh Mulligan in full flight is certainly really good fun to watch, and really kind of does add to that kind of free flowing attacking football that Hibs fans traditionally love to watch. And I think he's a big part of that. And I think again, you could see sometimes, even with Chiba doing his best to do the running of 3 or 4 men in midfield last season, you could just see how much Mulligan was missed. And I think, assuming that he plays a part against Brøndby, he'll show again just why he was so much in demand before he came to Hibs, and why he continues to be in demand as well, because he's just one of those sort of all action box to box midfielders that every manager loves to have in their team. Just kind of runs and runs and runs. And hopefully he does stick around for a bit, because I think he's a player who a lot of Hibs fans really enjoy watching, and we probably like the chance to appreciate him for a little bit longer before he inevitably moves on to the next stage in his career.
Yeah, backtracking a wee bit, so I didn't want to cut off a Patrick McPartlin in full flight. I didn't want to rob Hibs fans of that particular experience, but I think with the Scotland thing in mind, it is worth mentioning the fact that there will be a new Scotland manager. I see Steve Clarke stepping down from the job after the World Cup, so now is the time for players like Josh Mulligan, like Kieran Bowie, to prove that they should be in that conversation. You do feel that in terms of those sort of initial exchanges with Hibs, should your prophecy or not quite prophecy of him leaving in the next 10 to 14 days not come true, we hope it doesn't.
That was a fear, not a prophecy.
Yeah, well, there's a prophecy now. Well, you hope that he'll be at Hibs and at his best, because that is the time for a player of his caliber and his age and his sort of stage in football to show to a new manager that he should be in that conversation and find his spot when there is that sort of little bit of change going on behind the scenes.
And if he's at Hibs, then he's guaranteed to be starting games week in, week out. And he may get that at another team, but at Hibs it's guaranteed, I think, for this season. And so maybe in a perfect world, you'd say sort of spend another season at Hibs, and then kind of look to take the next step after that, and sort of get into that Scotland squad, because for Hibs, it's in Hibs' interest for Mulligan to get into that Scotland squad, because that raises his profile, it raises the level of interest, it increases the interest, so that when it does become harder and harder to hold on to him, then the player has his pick of clubs to go to, and Hibs can kind of keep increasing the asking price or add-ons and just say, look, they can just say, look, this is his ceiling, this is what he's done for us, this is what he's capable of doing. So
yeah,
we're not about to lose a player of his caliber for less than we think he's worth. And I think the fact that Hibs did manage to get 6 million for Kieran Bowie, I mean, that has to be the benchmark. And I know strikers always go for more, but I think you look at what Mulligan brings to that Hibs side, you look at what other players or other teams in Scotland, are kind of demanding for players these days, and I think it's good to see that. And I think that Hibs probably deserve a lot of credit for managing to do that with a lot of players, just to maximise, the sort of money they're making on them in a lot of cases. And I think, Mulligan will be no different. But, that's probably a conversation that the club hierarchy will be having with Mulligan and saying, look, we know there's interest. We know you're an ambitious guy. We know you want to kind of go as high as your as high as your sort of talent will take you. But I think they'll say, spend another season here. You're guaranteed to get games. You're guaranteed to be the main man. Very good chance you manage to force your way into the Scotland setup. And, who knows, that if he leaves Hibs having helped them to a very good league position, won a trophy, then he will have his kind of pick of where he goes next. And, that's not a terrible position to be in for either him or the club. So, lots of factors, or lots of reasons for him to stick around at Easter Road for another season or so. So hopefully that happens. Hopefully we get to see the best of him for longer than a sort of 5 or 6 month period this time.
There you go, Josh. If you're listening, then there you are. Lead Hibs to league glory and a trophy or two to boot as well. But I really like your point about just wrapping up. I really like your point about the preseason story with Cliftonville, because I think one of my bugbears with preseason, right, is I understand the argument of, the result doesn't count. It's like, how much can you read into a preseason friendly? One of the most important things I find, or in my opinion at least, people can disagree with me, they're more than welcome to. A lot of people do.
They usually do, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's more of a comment on me. But it's this idea that, moments like that set the standard, and it sets the standard for the season. Mm-hmm. And, something like the Shamrock Rovers game, don't read too far into a 1-0 defeat. There are a lot of factors that go into it, but something like a player sort of demanding that standard. I mean, it does seem slightly unusual in a sort of friendly game, but I found this with the under-19s game at Musselburgh as well. And I was speaking to a former Hibs footballer about this, and sort of saying that, that's the time where you kind of want to set that standard. You want to show, you set the mentality for the season. I think that's something the under-19s did really well. It looked for a while as if it was going to end sort of 1-1. And, you sort of think fair play. It's a senior Musselburgh side, sort of strong senior side, a lot of sort of their good players.
Season
and
last year. Playing
against sort of 16, 17-year-olds in some cases. Possibly 15 as well, but don't quote me on that. I think there was a 15-year-old involved, at least, sort of coming off the bench. But the point is, sort of quite a young side, missing some of the key players from last season. And yet there's still this intensity and this demand from, it was Josh McDonald in this case, to sort of say, I've got the ball, it's the 89th minute, it's pre-season. No, I mean, he takes the ball and goes, I'm going to have a shot from here, I'm going to try. The late winning mentality defined that side's season last season. Season.
Did, but at the same time, if you're playing for a team coached by Darren McGregor, then you're not going to want to go back into that changing room and have to sort of face the question: do you think you could have done more to win that? And be saying yes, because that's not something you would want to say to Darren McGregor. So that you want to be able to go in there saying, we did our damnedest to win the game, and we saw this, as you say, so often last season. Hibs popping up with late goals in those games, and maybe it is the sort of the McGregor fear. I don't know. Maybe this is a thing that we need to explore further. But no, all joking aside, I think that when you have somebody like McGregor who's played for Hibs, who knows the standards as you were talking about, and is really keen for as many of these young players, obviously, to kind of continue that pathway to the Hibs first team, and if not to the Hibs first team, then at least to a good level in football, wherever that may be. Yeah. You look at some of the players who left Hibs at the end of last season: Owen Calder, Dean Cleland, are the sort of the two that kind of stick out for me. Cleland went back to Stranraer, where he had a good period on loan last season, and Owen Calder's joined up with East Kilbride in League One, and that's sort of really, I think that's good moves for the two of them, because quite often players sort of, they let go by the academies, and then they maybe go into, it could be like East of Scotland level, it could be Lowland League level. In some cases they will work their way up, in other cases they may sort of come in higher up and then maybe have to drop a little. But a lot of them, and not just at Hibs, just in general, do kind of sink without a trace a little bit. So I think it's a sign of that Hibs team that you've got players like Zach Bruce, who has really impressed in pre-season, so many figures that Hibs sort of talking positively about him. David Gray, especially.
So many figures outside of Hibs talking about him positively as well. I mean,
exactly.
I'll finish my point in a minute. No. I was just going to say pop onto the site, and there's a wee snippet from an interview from Stranraer talking about Zach Bruce. He got man of the match on Saturday while he was one of those figures missing while Hibs were playing against Musselburgh. Yeah. So yeah, very, very sort of credited, very lauded player.
And I think you see that, and even with the likes of Joel McGrath as well, Lewis Gilly, these players who have kind of taken that next step, and they've had that involvement in pre-season. A very good chance that they'll be involved in Europe, at least in the early stages, and then you're maybe looking at obviously Gilly's gone to Stranraer as well with Zach Bruce. McGrath, you'd imagine, having done well at Stranraer last season, they might be looking to get him a loan sort of higher up the SPFL. And there's other players who are probably in that sort of position as well. But it's I think it's good to have that mentality at the under-19 level of basically it is that kind of we never stop. It's like you keep going to the 95th, 96th minute, because that's the way that's the only way you can say we did our damnedest to get a result. And again, if we're seeing that in the first team during pre-season, again, it tells a story about standards. It tells a story about desire and commitment. And I think that's not every football team has that. Not every Hibs team has had that in fairly recent history. And I think when you've got players like that who are prepared to kind of ball out their colleagues in a pre-season bounce game for not making the right pass after sort of 11 or 12 minutes, then I think you're probably in a pretty good place going into the season.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially going into this season, I mean, you mentioned sort of recent memory. I think you could even look back to last season and say there were too many times when it was an 85-minute performance or an 80-minute performance and just lacking something at the end, lacking that moment of concentration. So, I don't know, maybe Darren McGregor needs to come in and do some motivational speaking and sort of strike the fear into the Hibs first team going into this season. But having players like Mulligan around who can set the standard, definitely, I mean, as you said, Pat Slack said it himself, the responsibility, it doesn't matter who wears the armband. There are lots of players there who can drive that standard and sort of make sure that that's going to be something that goes into what will be a very important season where
Pat Slack was another player, actually, just going back to that Cliftonville game, sorry to interrupt, but Pat Slack was another player who wasn't shy in making his feelings known when he sort of bombed down the wing to provide an option for one of the forwards, shall we say, and then didn't get the pass. The move came to nothing, and he was not best pleased. There was sort of quite a loud, heavily accented suggestion that the player in question should go elsewhere at sort of rapid pace. So I think obviously it's just having that. It's good natured. There's no rifts or anything, but it's just that desire during games, even bounce games in pre-season, of just we're trying to do the best we can here. We need, there are standards, we have to meet them. And if we're not meeting them, then, we're going to pull each other up about it. And, we've heard from David Gray, we've heard from the players, we've heard from sort of previous players who've kind of come into the club and then left, just how good the dressing room is and that sort of, the team spirit that's in there. And I think, things like this, anecdotes like this, just sort of, hammer that home, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. I know we mentioned Darren McGregor. I mean, I remember when I spoke to Kieran himself, actually, when he was talking about getting a David Gray hairdryer treatment on more than a couple of occasions. It's driving that standard, and it's driving it early because it's not long until European football kicks off. I'm all booked up today to go wherever it is that Hibs end up. We'll have a look and see what happens in that second leg between Vlasnia and Malasheva, I think on Wednesday afternoon now. So we'll know a little bit earlier than we thought we might previously, but we will obviously keep you up to date with that. We're going to call time on this one, this 20-minute podcast that Patrick and I planned. So if there's any other reason that you need to subscribe to the Hibs Observer, it's the fact we give you 25 minutes for free, and we give you the best Hibernian journalism on the market as well over on our site. So don't look at me.
I mean, we weren't paying for the first 20 minutes, were they? Have I missed something? Did I miss a memo?
This was all the paywalled content. We're going into extra time. Join us on our Patreon page. Please do subscribe for free. It is free, and it massively helps our work, helps us to continue making our content. And do pop over to the website as well. Subscribe. As I said, it's £12 for 12 months. We have another interview coming up this week, as well as content from the Bromley pre-season game. We'll have another couple of podcasts and lots of articles throughout the week to keep you busy with all of your Hibs news coming up to that European game next week. So we'll see you then. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and see you soon.